Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our virtual town hall tonight on the 5 Massachusetts statewide ballot questions. I'm State Senator Jason Lewis and delighted to spend this time together this evening. I'm very grateful to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to discuss these very important ballot questions. I really appreciate everybody's commitment to civic engagement. So the plan is I'm going to just give a brief overview of the ballot initiative process in Massachusetts. I often get questions about how this process works and what happens if a ballot question does pass in the upcoming election. And after that, we're going to take each one of the 5 questions one at a time. I'll briefly just explain what each question is about, and then open it up to your questions. So we'll do, question 1. Then we'll, after answering, I'll do my best to answer your questions. Then we'll move to question 2, do the same thing, move to question 3, and so on. So hopefully we'll get to all your questions this evening on all 5 ballot questions and on the process itself. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So, all right, so let's dive in. Just first, as an overview of how the ballot question process works, it really began more than a year ago. Any person or organization that wanted to try to get a question onto the Massachusetts ballot for this election had to present a petition with 10 signatures and the language that they were proposing back not this summer, but the summer before. So what would that be? The summer of 2023. And they presented that to the Attorney General in Massachusetts. The Attorney General's office does an initial review. Basically, there's some minimum standards that any potential ballot question has to meet. And they determined, which of those questions, I think there were several dozen that were proposed back at that time, which ones could move forward. Next step in the process is that by December of that year, 2023, the petitioners had to gather at least 74,574 signatures from all different counties around the state in order to move forward in the process. So that's a pretty high bar. That's an extensive amount of effort that each petitioner had to put into their ballot question. Then in January of 2024, the beginning of this year, all of those questions that had gotten the necessary signatures were then presented to the Massachusetts state legislature. And the legislature had the opportunity to either take up and pass one or more of those measures, propose alternate language and pass it through the legislature, or take no action. The Senate president and the Speaker of the House made the decision this year, which is not something they always do, but this year they did make the decision to create a special legislative committee to research and review the 5 ballot questions. There were 4 state representatives appointed to that committee, both Democrats and Republicans, and 4 senators appointed to the committee, also Democrats and a Republican. And I was very pleased to be one of those senators that Senate President Karen Spilka appointed to serve on that special committee. So that committee held public hearings to hear testimony from the proponents and opponents and experts on each of the 5 questions, and did background research and really looked into the each of the petitions. In the end, the committee recommended no action, that the legislature take no action on all 5 of those initiatives. That was the majority view on all 5, although I did not concur with the majority on questions 2 and 3, which we'll talk more about this evening. But because the majority of the committee recommended no action, the legislature passed on them. At that point in time, the petitioners then had to gather an additional 12,529 signatures by the end of June, and that then got those questions on to the ballot. And there are, as you know, there are 5 questions that made it all the way through that gauntlet and are on the ballot, and you all will have the opportunity to weigh in, yes or no, on each of those questions. If a ballot question is approved by the voters, if it has a majority of the votes, after all the votes are counted on November 5th, it becomes the law in Massachusetts. It is exactly the same as if the legislature passes a bill and Governor Healy signs the bill into law. It has exactly the same effect and impact. So each of you as citizens has a very important responsibility because you are all effectively lawmakers when it comes to making a decision on how you want to vote on each of these ballot initiatives. And the last thing I'll point out is that it really is a privilege to be able to have these ballot questions go before the voters. Not every state does this or allows this. Massachusetts is one of 26 states, so roughly half the states, that do allow citizen-initiated ballot initiatives, ballot questions, which really gives voters the opportunity to participate more directly in the lawmaking process. So that's the background on this. And again, bottom line is if any of these questions receives a majority of votes November 5th, it will then become the law in Massachusetts, same as any other law that has been passed by the state legislature and signed by the governor. All right. By the way, I want to, before we go any further, I want to thank Paul Albright from my team. Paul's done a terrific job organizing tonight's town hall, and he is running everything behind the scenes tonight. So thank you, Paul. So what we're going to do now is Paul's going to bring up question number 1. We'll go through that, answer questions on question 1, then we'll move to question 2 and so forth. So in order to ask your questions, please type them into the live chat. So any questions that you want to ask me about any of the questions, 5 questions, please type them into the live chat. If you have more than one question, which is totally fine and welcome, just please type each question into a separate message, in a separate message. It'll just be easier for Paul and I to respond to them. So feel free to start typing them in now if you have questions on any of the ballot initiatives. But again, we will get to each of them when we discuss that particular ballot initiative. All right, so I think without further ado, we're going to dive right into question number 1. So I know some of you already have probably looked at the red book that is mailed to all voters by the Secretary of State's office. But just for those of you who still are figuring out, what each question is, here's a summary of question 1, which relates to whether the state auditor has the authority to perform audits of the state legislature. So if you were to vote yes on question 1, you would be codifying in the law that the state auditor does have the authority to audit the legislature. And if you vote no, then it would basically leave the state law the way it is now, which has been interpreted by the legislature and also by Attorney General Andrea Campbell, who reviewed it, that under current law, the state legislature, does not have the authority to audit the legislature. So that's what a yes and no vote means. So just to clarify some background here, this was never an issue that had ever come up before. The role of the state auditor is a position that was created many, many decades ago by the state legislature. And the job of the state auditor, which is the position is currently held by Diana DeZoglio, the role of the state auditor's office is to conduct performance audits of state agencies. So that would include, obviously, everything that you're all familiar with, the Registry of Motor Vehicles, the MBTA, the Mass Health Program, the Department of Children and Families, all these different executive branch agencies that have important responsibilities to, to enforce and implement and enforce the laws in Massachusetts and to implement all the different programs that we have. The state auditor is supposed to make sure that they are not just spending their money properly, but also that all of their systems and processes are being done according to the law and regulations. They're operating efficiently and effectively. So that's what the state auditor does. The state legislature, which is made up obviously of the House of Representatives and the Senate, does have its books audited every year by an outside auditing firm. So that's just a traditional financial audit to make sure that the money that we're spending on, staff salaries, any other expenses that the legislature has, that those expenses are accounted for. So those audits are performed already every year. They have been for a long, long time. And those results, are made available to the public. But what the state auditor is proposing is to be able to conduct performance audits of the state legislature, which would look at everything about how the state legislature functions, how committee assignments are made, how it's determined who chairs any individual committee, how it's determined, what bills are prioritized and taken up and come to the floor for debate, and all kinds of other processes and decisions that the legislature makes. So it is the view of the legislative leadership and the constitutional scholars that have been consulted that it would be a violation of separation of powers for the state auditor to be able to audit the legislature, because the state auditor is a member of the executive branch of government. Obviously, the legislature is the legislative branch. And so, I'm sure you all know from your civics classes, we have a very important principle of separation of powers. It's in the Massachusetts state constitution, which is really was the template for the United States Constitution. And so it appears in both the Mass state constitution and is in the United States Constitution. So what that means is it is the contention of the legislative leadership, and I do believe from all the legal experts and constitutional scholars I've spoken to that this is certainly the case, that the state auditor, even if ballot question 1 were to pass, the state auditor would still not have the constitutional authority to be able to audit the legislature because it's a different branch of government. And by the way, the same is true of her power to audit the judicial branch of government, that she does not and would not have that power either. Obviously, an exception to that would be if consent were given. So if the judicial branch said to the auditor, we want you to come in and audit the appeals court in some particular area, then that would be different. Similar if the legislature requested that the auditor come in, conduct an audit of, let's say, our human resource functions. We could do that, and that would be fine. But a broad audit that is not approved by the legislative branch, or in the case of the judiciary by that branch, I believe would be a violation of separation of powers. So anyway, but voters will get to decide on this. If it does pass, I do expect it's likely to be challenged in court. And so ultimately it may be up to what our courts decide whether indeed it is a violation of separation of powers or not. I should also just say, and then I'll take your questions, I certainly do recognize that there are valid, criticisms and concerns about the transparency of the state legislature. I do think there's a lot we do that is very transparent and available to the public in terms of all the public hearings we hold. All of our sessions are held, and when the Senate meets or the House of Representatives are all live streamed, available to the public, and lots of other things we do. But there are other kinds of processes that may be less visible to the public. And I know that there are times when the public would like more information about what the legislature is doing and what's happening with certain bills. So I certainly support efforts to improve the transparency and accountability of the state legislature. That's always been important to me in my time serving, and I think we have done a lot over the years to strengthen and improve that. But I do think there's more that can be done and should be done. And regardless of what happens with question 1, I'll certainly continue to support efforts to improve the accessibility and transparency of the legislature to the voters of Massachusetts, which is who we're elected to serve. So let's see if we have any questions. Looks like we don't. So we're going to move on then from question 1, and we're going to now take up question number 2. So question number 2 is getting a lot of discussion and debate, as you may be aware. And that's for good reason. Question number 2 is a very important and a very complicated policy issue. as you can see here, it deals with whether or not the MCAS, which is a standardized test that students in Massachusetts public schools take, whether that should continue to be linked to a high school diploma, or whether we should change the current system and no longer require high school students to get above a certain minimum score on the 10th grade MCAS tests in order to get their high school diploma. So a few things that hopefully will be helpful to you to understand about this question. And I should add, for those of you who don't know, I have the privilege of serving as the Senate chair of the Education Committee. So obviously this being an education policy issue, it's one that I'm have spent a lot of time on. And we did actually, back in the spring, we did try to negotiate a compromise on this question. There was representatives from the Senate, myself, from the House of Representatives, from the administration, and we sat down with the leaders of the teacher unions. The teacher unions are the proponents of this ballot question. We did sit down, had many meetings and many conversations to see if we could try to reach a compromise here, which would have meant that this question would not have gone on the ballot and it would have been resolved through the legislative process. Unfortunately, we made a lot of progress in those conversations, but we weren't quite able to get all the way there. And so because of that, the Massachusetts Teachers Association made the decision to move forward and to put this question on the ballot. So the main proponents are the Mass Teachers Association and the American Federation of Teachers, which are our two main teacher unions in the state. And then on the other side of this question, there's a variety of different business groups for the most part. This question has also split sort of our elected leaders and officials coming down on different sides. And, you know, what I would say is I really believe everyone has the best of intentions for the well-being of our students in our schools. I really believe that everyone is coming at this issue wanting to do what's best for all of our students, and especially students from disadvantaged backgrounds, and to make sure that every student, regardless of their background and what high school they attend or what school district they attend, is getting the best possible education and has the best possible opportunities to succeed in life after high school. But there is a different perspective on the role that standardized tests should play in that decision process around a high school diploma. So currently in Massachusetts, a student has to do two things to get a high school diploma. They have to first get above a minimum score on the 10th grade MCAS test, which is the math test, the English language arts, and science. So there's three different MCAS tests, all of which there's a sort of a minimum score that's set that they need to kind of get above that. If they don't get that score the first time, they do have the opportunity to retake the test. And there's also a separate process that some students can go through. They can qualify for as an alternative. And then the second thing that a student has to do is they have to meet whatever the requirements are of their own high school. So every high school in Massachusetts has its own requirements for a student to graduate. It could involve typically it involves taking certain courses, could involve doing community service project, things like that. So students have to do both. There's about 700 students annually, which is about 1% of the graduating high school seniors every year. So 700 who fulfill their own high school's graduation requirements, whatever high school they attend, but they don't get that minimum score on one or more of those three MCAS tests. And so those 700 are students who would otherwise have gotten a high school diploma, but do not get one. So they finish high school, they get a certificate of completion, but not a diploma. And so that does have obviously a significant impact on their future prospects. The argument that's also made by the proponents is that requiring students to get the certain passing scores on these tests, requires teachers to really teach to the tests and forces a narrowing of the curriculum because there's so much focus on math, English, science to the detriment, of other subjects like social studies, the arts, and so on. The opponents of the ballot question who want to keep the current system, they argue that we need to maintain that single standardized test. It's the same test applied across, all 10th grade students in the state in order to continue to maintain the high standards in our state. It should be noted that even if ballot question 2 passes, the MCAS tests will still be required in Massachusetts. They are required under both state and federal law that we give those assessments. They are actually given in 3rd grade, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade MCAS tests in both math and English, and then in science in certain grades as well, and in 10th grade. And that will continue to be the case, including in 10th grade, even if ballot question 2 passes. The difference is students will not have to get above a certain score on that 10th grade test as a requirement for graduation. So I've taken a public position on question 2. Some of you may be aware of that. For those who are not aware, I think Paul's going to put in the chat a link to the public statement that I released back in September on question 2. And basically, to summarize my position, I am going to be voting in favor of question 2. I do think that we get important data from standardized tests like MCAS, but I also think there are significant drawbacks, and that standardized tests are not capable of capturing, a holistic assessment of how our students are doing. And so I will be supporting question 2. At the same time, I also believe that we need to put an alternative, standardized, statewide, rigorous system in place for high school graduation, because I do not support just leaving this up to every one of our high schools to make that determination on their own, because then we would have lots of different, essentially, graduation standards, and wouldn't be clear what a Massachusetts high school diploma represents. So my intention, if question 2 passes, November 5th, is that I'm going to be filing legislation in the new legislative session in January to put in place an alternative statewide, consistent, high quality graduation standard that will be non-test based. It will be based around students having to take a certain set of course requirements in order to graduate. Right now, we have something called MassCore in our state, which is recommended for all graduating students, but is not required. Most other states, by the way, that's how they determine whether a student should get a high school diploma or not. It's based around completing a set of course requirements in high school. A certain number of years of math, certain number of years of English, certain number of courses in social studies, in the arts, in science, and so forth. So that would actually make Massachusetts more aligned with other states. Right now, fewer and fewer states are requiring students to get above a certain score on a standardized test to get their diploma. Used to be many more states. Now we're down to, I believe, only 7 states that have that requirement, one of which is New York, which recently a blue ribbon commission in that state recommended moving away from use of the Regents exam to determine high school graduation there. So I expect New York will be moving in a different direction as well. So that's an overview. I know, sorry for going on a bit longer there, but again, this question is pretty complicated, and thought hopefully that will be helpful as you think about it. And let's go ahead and take questions on this one. So first one is whether the question gets enough votes to pass or not. Can MCAS be revised to be more relevant to the students' learning abilities and cultural background so there's fair and relevant tests? Okay, thanks so much for this question, May. So the answer is absolutely yes. It is required, as I mentioned, by both state and federal law that we administer standardized assessments in Massachusetts in a variety of different grades, including 10th grade. But But the details of that assessment are left up to the state to determine. So exactly, how the test, which in Massachusetts is the MCAS, how that's constructed, what languages it's given in. Obviously, the English language arts has to be in English, but the math test and the science test right now is available in Spanish, but it certainly could be available in other languages besides Spanish. I think it should be. And other decisions about how long the tests are, exactly when they're administered, how much time students are taking away from their teaching and learning to take the tests, how quickly their results are provided back to students and teachers and their families. All of those kinds of things, absolutely there's room for improvement. I think almost everyone agrees that we do need to make these improvements. So I think it is true, regardless of what happens with question 2, there is going to be continued work, mostly led by our Department of Education, DESE, but potentially also with a role for the state legislature to continue to improve, how we use the MCAS and make sure it's giving us useful data, but is having as few unintended or negative consequences as possible. All right. Do we have any other questions? Let's see. Laura has one. How can we trust that the teachers union would be okay with your alternative? Very fair question. So what I'm going to be proposing, which, as I mentioned, is built around requiring students to complete the set of Mass Core courses, is not new. It's really well understood already. Again, it's been recommended for Massachusetts high school students for a decade and a half. I mentioned that we had a lot of discussions, back in the spring, and that included with the leadership of the teacher unions. And so we certainly spent a lot of time discussing this alternative of Mass Core being required as for graduation. And so I know there's a lot of support for this among, legislators, among a whole variety of stakeholders, including the teacher unions. It would have a lot of positive benefits because it would make sure that we have, rigorous and comprehensive course offerings across all of our high schools, so that all students would have access, to that rigorous set of courses in math, in science, in English, in the arts, in foreign language. And that would be a very positive thing for all of our students, and I think would strengthen our high schools. So there is broad support for that. But that said, the legislation that I'm planning to file, would go through the legislative process just like any other bill would. It's very possible that some of my colleagues could file bills in this similar space. Back in January, any state rep or state senator is free to file the bills they would like to file, and typically there's several thousand bills in the new session. So what will happen is the bill that I file, any other bills that are in the similar area will get likely referred to the Education Committee. They'll be reviewed and analyzed in that committee. There'll be a public hearing, likely next winter or spring, where experts and members of the public can weigh in. And then, it would have to work its way through the legislative process. So the teacher unions would get to weigh in. The superintendents and administrators would get to weigh in on this. Students, parents, other stakeholders, and I would certainly be seeking out their voices as we went through the process. So it is true, there's no guarantee that the bill I file, would get passed into law. But I do think there's going to be a strong desire for an alternative to be put in place. I think that's very likely something the governor's going to want to do. And so I feel, fairly optimistic that that something like what I'm proposing, would have a very good chance of passing the legislature next year. But again, I certainly acknowledge I cannot guarantee that. All right. I think we have one more question from Sherry. Is there any formal system of performance review? I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, Sherry. What we are talking about in ballot question 2 is how we evaluate This is back on question 1. Oh, I'm sorry. We're back to question 1. Paul's just correcting me. So we're back on question 1. So I think we wrapped up on question 2. Is that right? Okay. So just to let everyone know, we've finished up on question 2 for now. We may, if there's more questions on question 2, we can certainly return to it. But we got this question from Sherry on question 1, which again was back on the state auditor's authority to audit the legislature. Is there any formal system of performance review? I guess you're asking relative to the legislature. I guess there's the short answer is no. Again, there are financial audits that are conducted every year. We use an outside auditing firm to do those for the House and the Senate. And again, those are published on the legislature's website. But in terms of performance review, I guess the way I would, and I before I ran for the legislature, I worked in the private sector for a variety of different companies. And so I'm very familiar with, performance reviews and things that are conducted in the private sector. But I guess the way I would see this in the terms of the legislature is, our performance review is what did you get accomplished in a legislative session? What are the challenges that are facing the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? What did the legislature actually get done in order to address those challenges? And then every 2 years, it's up to the voters to decide if they're happy with the way that their their legislators are representing them. And so myself and all my colleagues in the legislature, we're on the ballot, every 2 years if we run for re-election. And then it's up to the voters to say, okay, I think my legislator is doing a good job, or pass judgment on the overall functioning of the legislature. And again, I think that's the right way for us to be held accountable. Whether, again, the challenges facing our state, whether they're housing affordability, climate crisis, gun violence prevention, adequate funding for our schools and for our higher colleges, our transportation infrastructure, economic development, all these different issues that I'd love to talk to you more about, but maybe in a different town hall. I think that's really how we should be held accountable. All right, so we're going to move on to question 3. So question 3 deals with another very important but also fairly kind of complicated policy area, which is dealing with gig economy workers. So these are workers who are basically conducting their jobs through an app. The most well-known category of gig economy workers, is rideshare drivers, also known as TNC drivers, or transportation network companies. So, people think of them as generally being Uber or Lyft drivers, although there are some other rideshare companies. But there has been a growing trend in our economy over the last decade where companies are trying to shift more and more of their workers from being, full-time or part-time employees of the company, where they are subject to, minimum wage, laws over, they qualify for minimum wage, for overtime, health insurance, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, anti-discrimination protections, all these things that we have, over many decades have fought for, and many advocates, many workers, labor unions have fought these battles. When companies move workers to being gig economy or app-based workers, none of that applies. So there's no protections, no minimum wage, no health care, no unemployment insurance. Workers have the benefit of perhaps more flexibility in working where and when they want, but they lose all of those other rights and benefits and protections that they had as employees. So this is a trend that's been happening. I think it's a very concerning trend, and it's something that is playing out, nationally. So this particular ballot question would, if you vote yes, it basically would allow the rideshare drivers in Massachusetts, I believe there's about 60,000 altogether, give or take, would allow them to, if they choose to, they could select a bargaining representative, essentially who they would represent them, a union that would represent them. And then they would be able to bargain collectively with the rideshare companies through a process known as sectoral bargaining. And that would be overseen by the State Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development to ensure it runs smoothly. And if there's any impasse, how that would get resolved. And then that would enable the drivers who currently have no voice at all, and they're just at the mercy of the companies. It would give them the ability to negotiate for, how much of the fare that the rider pays do they get to keep. And the companies have been keeping more and more of that over time and paying less and less to the drivers. So they have to drive, more and more hours just to make the same amount of money. So they'd be able to negotiate over that. They'd be able to negotiate over their working conditions, whether the companies should be providing, accident insurance or some form of workers' compensation, any kind of healthcare benefits, what kind of appeals process there would be if a driver is deactivated, all of those kinds of things. They'd be able to negotiate. A no vote would just make no changes, and the drivers would have no path to try to form a union, because right now, under current state law and under current federal law, as gig economy workers, there is no path for them, like there is for many other types of workers, to try to come together and form a union. So that's why question 3 would need to pass in order for them to have the ability to form a union. I should add that ballot question 3 is very similar to a bill that I've actually been championing in the legislature for a number of years. So it's an issue I care a lot about. And again, there's the bill that I've been pushing for that unfortunately has not moved forward in the legislature, but ballot question 3 is virtually identical to that. So I have also put out a public statement about question 3, and I will be voting in favor of question 3. And Paul's now going to put a link in the chat to that public statement that I put out there. So if you're interested in that, you can read my public statement on question 2 and on question 3. So let's see if we have any questions. All right. Thomas has one. Could a yes on question 3 potentially cause a segregation in Uber workers? I'm worried that it could. Not sure what you mean by segregation of Uber workers. If maybe can type into the message box if you could explain a little more what you mean by that, but I'll start to answer what I think maybe you're asking, but then again, you should clarify. So if the ballot question requires certain thresholds of certain percentages of drivers in order to vote at different stages in the process. So if enough voters, I believe it's 25%, vote to form a union, and at that point they'd be deciding who their representative is. Would it be SEIU or machinists or another union? Once they make that decision, if they do, then all of the drivers then are part of the union. So they would all then effectively be covered. It is true that not every single driver would get to vote to approve a contract. There is a threshold for a certain number of hours that somebody would need to have been driving, sort of a minimum number of hours in the previous, I believe I can't remember if it's calendar quarter, a certain period of time that you'd have to have driven, but it's a pretty low bar. So almost all drivers, who are certainly regular drivers, would get to have a voice in forming a union, and then they would certainly get to have a voice in whether they approve the contract or not. And then they would all be in that bargaining unit, and they would all be subject to that contract. And because it's sectoral bargaining, it's not separately with Uber and then separate with Lyft. So it works differently than the way unions bargain with individual employers in most cases. In this case, there would be an agreement reached sector-wide. So it would cover Uber, Lyft, and all the rideshare drivers, regardless of which company they drive for. And as you know, many of them drive for both companies or other companies as well that are operating in Massachusetts. So did that answer your question? All right, let's move to Laura's question. She says, one point of view that I heard from a friend that works at a school thought if this went through, it would be hard to find bus drivers. Ah, that's interesting. I have not heard that concern. I do have a concern about the number of bus drivers. That is one of the challenges that our schools have been facing is, finding enough bus drivers. And one of the costs that has been going up and up for our public school districts, is the cost of transportation. So definitely aware of that challenge. But I've never heard any concern about question 3 having any spillover effect to bus drivers. I don't foresee that making a difference. I think it would hopefully, would lift up rideshare drivers who I think right now really struggle to make a living, and I think are treated unfairly by the rideshare companies. So it would help them, but I'm not concerned that that's going to lead to, a huge influx into the of rideshare drivers, coming from other different types of jobs and industries. So I haven't heard this concern, and I don't think that this would be. I do, again, acknowledging that it is a challenge to find bus drivers, and we've been working to find ways to improve the school transportation services and the cost. But I'm not concerned that question 3 would be a factor in that. All right, are there any more questions on 3? Let's see. What would be in place to ensure that all the gig workers understand how to bargain when a lot may not be fluent in English, nor in a setting like work culture? Yeah, this is a really good question too. So that is one of the challenges here, that the rideshare drivers, they don't have a work site that they all go to, like a factory or a store. And you're right, many of them are not native English speakers. I've, met and talked with many drivers. I've been to a number of their rallies. Many of them are more recent immigrants, to the country. So one of the things that is I really like a lot is that the union that has kind of taken the lead in organizing the drivers, and in fact is the main union behind this ballot question, is SEIU 32BJ. And I don't know if you all are familiar with SEIU in general or SEIU 32BJ in particular, but SEIU is a phenomenal union. They just do a fantastic job representing service workers, and they're great. They just work so hard to lift them up, and they work very well with other stakeholders. They work very well with policymakers to collaborate on solutions. And SEIU 32BJ already represents lots and lots of workers who are non-English speakers, many of whom are recent immigrants to this country and to Massachusetts, and they do a great job. So I actually think if they are the ones that the drivers select to represent them, which I think there's a good chance that would be the case, they will be very well represented, and SEIU will work very hard to reach the drivers where they are, to communicate with them in multiple languages, to make sure that they know what their rights are, and to work with them to get the best possible contract they can. All right, let's see. Our next question is from Elizabeth. What would happen to gig workers that don't have an interest in joining a union? Many of the drivers I've spoken with are not in support of this. Have you ever known a lot of drivers? It is like other kinds of unions, which is, basically if more than a certain percentage of workers vote to form a union, then the union then applies to everybody in that workforce. So that's no different in this case than it would be, if auto workers in a plant in Detroit, vote to form a union, or Starbucks workers in a coffee shop in Boston vote to form a union. It's the same thing. As long as above a certain threshold vote to create the union, then effectively that union bargains on behalf of everybody. And that's important, because otherwise you'd essentially have free riders, where the union, the workers that are in the union, that are paying dues, that are working hard to improve pay and benefits for all the workers, the ones who are not in the union would be getting all of those benefits and higher pay, better benefits, better working conditions, but they wouldn't be contributing to the success of the union. So that's why you're preventing a free rider problem. So again, they would all effectively be part of the union, again, if enough drivers voted, in an election to form a union and to be, and they would get to vote on who their representative would be. And again, that's just the same as it would work for any set of workers who are deciding whether or not to form a union. All right, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for good questions on number 3. So moving on to question number 4. So number 4 deals with whether we should legalize certain kinds of psychedelic substances here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. A yes vote would allow for the legalization of certain natural psychedelics. The most well-known one is psilocybin, but there are several others as well. They're sometimes referred to as magic mushrooms. And they have been legalized in a few states at this point. I believe Colorado, Oregon, maybe there's one or two others, have done so. And this would enable voters to weigh in whether they want to do so in Massachusetts. A no vote would mean you'd keep the law the way it is so that these substances would continue to be illegal to either consume them, grow them, or sell them in Massachusetts. So let me explain if you vote yes. This has some similarities to the process we went through around cannabis, but it also has some very important differences. So this wouldn't really create a commercial market in psychedelics the way we created a commercial market in cannabis. It's not like retail stores with companies advertising their products and all of that whole infrastructure that's been built up around cannabis. This would be different. This would be if voters approve it, there would be certain locations which would then have the legal right to sell certain, again, approved psychedelic substances. It would probably start with psilocybin. Some others might get added over time. And you would go to that site, you would purchase it, and then you would consume it on the premises, and you would be under the supervision of someone who has been trained and licensed to supervise somebody taking one of these drugs. And that would be the extent of it. It wouldn't just be retail storefronts, selling these and people taking them on their own. It would be under the supervision of someone who has been trained. I'm no expert on these, but I have heard testimony that there are certainly people who have found psychedelics to be very beneficial to them. They are, can be very powerful drugs that there are people, and I've certainly heard this testimony from people suffering from anxiety, severe anxiety, depression, PTSD, including veterans suffering from PTSD, that they have found psychedelics to be very helpful to them in their mental health treatment. Although it's still a lot of research, still is being done, and there certainly are voices on the other side who still express some concerns about, how well understood these natural psychedelics are and how safe they are. One other thing I should add that the ballot question will allow is for people to grow a certain small amount in their own homes that they could consume themselves. So I know that, there might be some concern about that. That does worry me a bit, but, I imagine some of that's going on already in some people's homes. So, whether the passage of Q4 would change that in any material way, I'm not sure whether it would or not. And there would be, if question 4 passes, it would create a regulatory commission, kind of modeled after the gaming commission we have in Massachusetts or the cannabis commission that we have. And that members of that commission who would be appointed by the governor, the attorney general, and I believe the state treasurer, they would have the responsibility to develop the rules and the regulations that would implement this new system. So the ballot question only spells it out at a high level, but a lot of the detail would have to get developed by that commission, and it would happen over the next several years. So this certainly wouldn't happen overnight. There would be some time before these places would be open, people would be licensed and trained, to sell and administer the psychedelics, and people would be able to go and start taking them. So it would probably be a multi-year process. Do we have questions? Okay, looks like there aren't any questions on number 4. So let's move to our last question, which is number 5. And you've probably also been hearing quite a lot of discussion and debate about question number 5. I've had some personal experience with this question. Before I was the chair of the Education Committee, I did serve for a while as the chair of the Labor and Workforce Development Committee. And in that role, I helped to lead the passage of what became known as the Grand Bargain. This was back in 2018. And the Grand Bargain raised the minimum wage in Massachusetts from what was $10 an hour to $15 an hour, which is where it is now. And we phased that in over 5 years. So we fully phased it in now. The Grand Bargain also created a universal paid family and medical leave program in Massachusetts, which I'm very proud of. And so that was another outcome of that law. There were several other things that law did as well. But the reason I bring it up is when we were working on that Grand Bargain over a year, there was a lot of negotiation that went on with the business community and with various other advocacy groups and experts. We did look at this issue of the tipped minimum wage, it's also known as the sub-minimum wage, and whether we should phase it out or not, and did make a decision at that time to maintain, a tipped minimum wage and not to phase it out. So that was a decision we made back then. Obviously, question 5 puts this to you, the voters, and you all will get to decide, whether or not we continue. So a yes vote would mean that rather than having a lower minimum wage that tipped workers make, which it's currently $6.75 is the tipped minimum wage, that would get raised, I believe, over a 5-year period. Yes, over 5 years, it would get raised until it reaches $15 an hour, which is the same as the regular minimum wage. And then the other thing the ballot question would do is when it reaches 15, any tips that our customers give to their server or bartender would go, the restaurant could put them in a tip pool and then would be able to share them among all the workers, which includes the front of the house and the back of the house, like cooks and others who would otherwise not get tips. If you vote no on question 5, you're just leaving the law the way it is, the way it came out of the Grand Bargain, that I was talking about before, which means we would continue to have the $15 minimum wage that applies to most workers, and then the $6.75 per hour minimum wage that applies to workers that make tips. One very important thing that I should point out here that maybe folks don't know is that it is required under the state law that a tipped worker does still need to make at least the regular minimum wage every hour. So what happens is if the $6.75 per hour that they get in the minimum wage, plus whatever tips they make in that pay period, let's just say over a week, if that doesn't add up to at least the $15 per minimum per hour, then their employer, typically a restaurant, has to make up the difference. So in effect, they are still guaranteed making at least the regular minimum wage, but they're making that partially through the tip minimum that the restaurant is paying them, and through the tips that they're receiving from customers is how they're effectively, that's the thinking behind having the tip minimum, is that you add the tip minimum wage plus the tips they receive, and then they should be receiving at least the regular minimum wage. And if they don't, the restaurant is supposed to make up the difference. So this question has created pretty fierce debate. I would say on one side, you certainly have a set of tipped workers, some tipped workers who do support, doing away with the tip minimum. You have a national organization called One Fair Wage that has been fighting this battle all around the country. They've had some success in a number of other states. And they argue that it's a matter of fairness, and that no one should have to work for, depend on tips to make a decent living. So that's the side that's the proponent. The opponent, certainly, as you probably are aware, the restaurant owners all don't like question 5. They say it's going to increase their labor costs and force them to raise menu prices. And it also splits the servers. You've probably heard from some servers in some of the restaurants you go to, who don't want to see question 5 pass. I think they're worried about not basically getting smaller tips. Because I guess if customers feel like the server's getting the minimum wage, maybe they don't need to tip them as much. I don't know if that's true or not, or how people will feel in terms of their tipping behavior should this pass, but I think that is the concern that some servers in some restaurants have. So it kind of splits the servers, that's where we are on question 5. So let's see if we have any questions. Okay, we don't have any questions on 5, but Paul's telling me we do have some on question 4. So we're going to go back to question 4, which, as a reminder, was the one that would legalize and regulate certain psychedelic substances like psilocybin. Question from Elizabeth. If Oregon and Colorado allow for these substances to be grown from home, I don't know the answer to that question. We can check into that. So maybe, Elizabeth, follow up with my office. Just email us or call my office. Maybe, Paul, you could put that in the chat. We'll look into that. I am going to go out on a limb here and say I think they probably do allow it, because the folks that wrote this ballot question, they certainly were looking at the experience in Colorado and Oregon as a model for what to do in Massachusetts. And so I suspect if Colorado and Oregon do not allow any home growing, they probably would not have proposed that in the Massachusetts ballot question, but we can confirm that. All right. Is there research to know the long-term effects? Good question. Thanks, Rosa. So, this is where there's still some debate. We certainly heard testimony in that committee that I mentioned that I sat on to evaluate the ballot questions. We certainly heard some testimony from medical experts that, they think that psychedelics are safe and they have a therapeutic benefit for certain types of people, again, suffering from, in some cases, pretty severe anxiety, depression, PTSD, and they've seen some remarkable, results for those people in having breakthroughs in their therapy after taking psychedelics. I do think there are some other medical experts who are not yet convinced, and they would probably say that we need to do more research. They're not convinced yet whether they are entirely safe and what the long-term effects are. So probably this is an area where I think there might still be some disagreement. Personally, for me, from what I've seen and the evidence and the research, and I admit I'm certainly no expert here, but from what I have seen, I do think there's sufficient, evidence and research already to back up that there is a medical or therapeutic value in these substances, in these drugs. That said, I do think, they have to be taken, very carefully under appropriate supervision. This is not something that, somebody should be taking, like you might have a glass of wine or, or consume cannabis or something else like that. All right, let's see what Sherry's question is. Would a person be required to have a prescription from a fully qualified medical professional before being able to use this? No, the answer to that's a good thought question as well. The answer is no. This would not require somebody to, go to their own physician and get a prescription the way they would for an antidepressant, for example, or any other medication. It would be something that they would go to one of these centers, and then essentially there would have to be like a screening process that they would go through, so that the folks that work in these centers who would be trained, but not necessarily medical professionals, but they would have certain amounts of training, and there would be a licensure process they would go through with the state. They would conduct a screening. So there would be a process to determine if somebody is appropriate to take one of these substances, and all of those details in terms of what the training is, what the licensure process is, what the screening questions would be. All of that is not really spelled out in the ballot question. The ballot question says it has to be created and implemented, but it's left up to the new commission that would be created to go ahead and create those detailed regulations. And that's not unusual. I mean, that is in large part how the cannabis industry worked. You know, the ballot question and then the law that we passed kind of set up the framework, but then the Cannabis Control Commission, you know, put in place all the detailed rules and regulations. And the same was true for what the Gaming Commission did for the gaming industry. So that's how it would work. But as far as I know, it would not require somebody's medical professional, you know, a mental health practitioner or whoever they currently are seeing to actually have to write a prescription. So, you know, it's a valid point. Maybe that is something that, you know, should be required, but it's not spelled out in the ballot question. All right. We are just at about a little after 8 o'clock, and Paul's telling me we don't have any more questions. So really, thank you so much to everyone who joined us. Really appreciated this conversation. Appreciated your terrific questions. Hope my answers were helpful. And if you have any other questions, you think of something, you know, after tonight, feel free to reach out to my office, call us or email us or send us a message on social media, and we will certainly try to get you further information as soon as possible. So good luck making your final decisions on these ballot questions. Remember, the decisions that we all make as voters will determine what the law will be in Massachusetts going forward after November 5th. So it's a pretty important responsibility that we all have. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again to Paul, and have a very good night.